And good evening, everybody. I have to say that even by the very high standards of the speakers who we've been privileged to have here at BLT in Bushey, what we have for you tonight is a speaker who is really off the scale. Hermie Rothman is somebody who, as some of you may know, came from the sort of background that some people in the community also came from, but what he went on to do was something extraordinary by any measure. He came on Kindertransport in the last week before wartime from Germany. He volunteered for the British Army, and as the war ended, he found himself working for British intelligence in Germany, where, as he is about to tell us, he, together with a small team he was working with, came across something that historians ever since have been confounded by, which was the original will of Adolf Hitler. Hermie and his extraordinary story will speak for itself, so I will say no more at this stage, other than to say that after Hermie has spoken, he's kindly agreed to stay on to take questions, not just from me. I will probably ask just one, because I know that all of you will have questions of your own. So after Hermie has spoken, there will be plenty of time for you to ask whatever questions you may ask. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, may I introduce Mr. Hermie Rothman.
I'm afraid I will have to start at giving you a few figures, because they are necessary so that you understand fully what was involved and what was the history of Germany in about 3 or 4 minutes. In 1870, Germany was fighting France and Austria were fighting on the side of Germany. It backed out. They won the war. Germany won. So it's 1-0 to the Germans. Then in 1418, the Germans fought again. They lost. It's 1-1. And then in 39-45, as you know, they lost. So it's 2-1 to us. That's how I see it in simple terms. However, what happens is a lot of things not in the front of everybody, but in little things happen which were never exposed to the press. And I'm telling you about the Hossbach. Does anybody heard the name Hossbach? Right. Let me tell you, it was brought to the notice in 1945 for the first time, and people did not know what happened. Now, the Hossbach file takes about, in this thing here, about 3 or 4 pages, and that is very, very important to understand Hitler and Germany. In 1937, a number of about 5 or 6 German high-ranking generals met and discussed the question of having a war against England, France, Russia, everywhere, in order to expand, to find Lebensraum, if you know the English translation of is wanting space to become self-supporting. And that's also another word which has the phrase is altering, that is completely self-dependent and be able to conquer where necessary the East and the West. And this has never been exposed until 1900 and I'm not quite sure, 1948 or 47 at a trial. And I, quite frankly, I also was ignorant of what happened. And I read out about the Hossbach fire. There were, as I said, 5 or 6 generals, the highest rank, including Hermann Göring. And they said that Hitler is planning to have, if necessary, war. If he can't have it by political means, but then he will go to war. And if that is necessary, it will may take 1943 or to 1945 to achieve that aim of expanding, finding Lebensraum. And that is most interesting because it sums up what Hitler had in mind. He wasn't quite satisfied of going to Austria alone, or to Czechoslovakia, or to going perhaps into Poland. But in 1937, it was on the 5th of November, a document was published to this effect. Now I'm going to leave that aside. That is the technical side, which are, however, important to know, because if somebody says Hitler, like A.J. Forgot his name for a moment. A.J. Taylor. He said that Hitler, if you would have made peace with him earlier, he would have not gone to war. Nonsense. A.J.P. Taylor is saying that all these things do happen, and if no action is taken, then perhaps the West is at fault for not starting to negotiate with Germany. He was wrong. I believe Trevor Roper, who is also a historian, who in actual fact I worked for in the army for a little while in connection with Hitler's work. Now, let's come to something very important. Germany in the 20s said, we lost the war, but we're having a good time. We're going to spend, especially, although we have liabilities because we lost the war, however, we're going to have a good time. And they spent a little bit too much. And up comes Dawes, an American, who said we have to lend Germany money to pay back their duties to us. So there came the Dawes plan. Germany, however, spent them again, had a good time, everybody was eating well, and everything was wonderful in Germany during this period between 1918 and 1939. And again, in 1929, Mr. Young said we have to give more money to the Germans to pay us back. Also nonsense. The Reichsbank went beholle. People in 1929, 1930, 31 were in a terrible state. I made it as simple as that so that you understand the situation which prevailed in Germany at the time. And there was no way they could have repaid either Dawes nor Young. And Hitler, as you know, and I'm not going to deal with what Hitler did in 1933 up to 1939, the time when I left and subsequent, because that is history which you know only too well, and I don't need to repeat it. There is some wonderful stories to tell about reaction against Hitler, and overturning the National Socialists. As you know, the National Socialists did not have a majority. It only had it was the largest party, but not the Social Democrats and the Communists had more votes in 1933 than Hitler did. However, in a dictatorial way, he stopped all the other parties, as you know. I don't wish to go too much into the what happened in 33 to 39. You've heard of concentration camps, and for the ugly things which it took against the Jews, and the Jewish people suffered tremendously until the war came, and then it got worse. He wasn't accountable to anyone, only to himself and the Nazi Party, if that. Now, before I say something about Hitler's will which he made, I just want to say that I started joining the British Army in the beginning of 1944, and I had a very checkered career. First of all, I worked for the intelligence of a Scottish division, namely the 51st Division of the British Army, which was the Lowland Division. I was working for the intelligence at the time, and then I had the wonderful support of Colonel Merrill. He was in charge of the 51st Division and the 52nd Division, but he was a very, very nice man to know, who was somewhat impressed by the little work which I did for him. I had made an application myself to join the Jewish Brigade. I wanted to go, if I went to fight against Hitler, I wanted to do it in the Jewish Brigade. And roughly about in March or beginning of April 1945, my transfer to the Jewish Brigade came through. But so I went to Colonel Melvin and said to him, look, I'm so happy here because you're a very nice man who give me all the comfort which one can enjoy as in intelligence here, and I think I do a relatively good job for you. Would you mind if I would stay? He said, I would like you to stay, however, for your benefit, it would be better if you leave, because by the time they send you back to Scotland and transfer you to the Jewish Brigade in fighting in Italy, there's a long period. And knowing the Jewish army, first of all, the war will finish, he said, won't take very long. And by the time you come and join the Jewish Brigade, there'll be peace. And how right he was. I took that on, and I was indeed very, very lucky that I went to a school where they taught us to speak German, which we could do quite well, and they taught us also French, which I didn't do too well either. So I was transferred to the 3rd Counterintelligence section of the British Army. And that's how something very, very exciting thing happened during that period. First of all, when I joined the third section of the intelligence section, I interrogated people, apart from meeting Robert Well, I will not go into the details. You know him all too well. He committed suicide, this gentleman. He starts on with Robert. Robert Maxwell. He was also doing intelligence work. I met him there. This is first excitement. I didn't know he was going to be famous at a later stage. But coming back to the work which I did, I interrogated from morning to night. We were 5 Jewish boys, similar to myself. They all came from Germany. However, they all changed their names. Yes. I did not change my names. What I did is I anglicized it. I knocked off the Hermie and I called myself Harry. And as far as Rothman is concerned, I knocked off another N from Rothman. And that's the anglicized way of changing my names. The others changed it very, very exciting. And I don't want to say what their name was before or afterwards. But we were very happy to translate and do our job. And then something very exciting in a way, but historically very important happened to us. The telephone rang, which was very unusual, at 5 o'clock in the morning. When I answered, my Captain Reed said that I must come to the office immediately. Now, what can be so exciting at 5 o'clock in the morning that one has to come to the office at 5, or at least 6? I said, can I come and have my breakfast first? And to my agreed, have your breakfast and come immediately. I got to the office at 6 o'clock, and I found all the doors locked. The windows, the curtains were drawn, light, and he said to me, read this. And what I found, it was Hitler's will. Not a copy. And in addition to Hitler's will, there was Goebbels' addendum. And we then, the 5 of us, shared out what we're going to translate into English. I did, for some reason or other, I did Goebbels' addendum, because Goebbels was a writer. He was the champion propagandist of the Nazi Party. He wrote, if I tell you this edition, the appendix to Hitler's will, was written in perhaps 2 or 3 sentences, but it was enormously long. And I tell you about the excitement which I had beginning of this year. I went to the Imperial War Museum, and for the first time in nearly 70 years, they brought out for me the original will of Hitler and the addendum of Goebbels. And I was overcome really with emotions when I saw it. Immediately I read it and I sat down and saw it. I was overcome with emotions really, because that brought back all my fellow Jewish interrogators, who unfortunately were very much older than me, who were not available to see it. You must realize that I was only 20 years old when I saw Hitler's will for the first time and translated my part into English. And that was so emotional because they took this again, they keep it under a certain light, and also the temperature must be exactly so that it will last for a very, very long time. They have never done it before. They did it in this year, 2014, about January. That's by the way. Now, coming back to Hitler. What did he write? What was the political message he wanted to proclaim? It was mostly about Jewish people, how they were, the devils, that I'm going to use in my own words, he didn't use the word devil, who started the war, really, a diatribe against the Jews. That was his political message. His private message was that he didn't have very much, and the little one which he had, he disposed of his paintings to this one, to this one, this one, but it went to Germany. He doesn't want anything else. That's what he possessed, that he gave away. When now the case come up, he must have had a fortune from selling his books, Mein Kampf and all the rest of it. Everybody got a copy. Where's the money? Where's the money? He certainly said nothing was thought that he possessed a fortune. People maintain, and I went and I don't know whether people saw me there on Channel 5. Also, I spoke about this in a very short way, and then the conclusion I leave to yourself. I don't think, personally speaking, he was had any money. If he did have, he disposed of the money in a very private way. Now, I come to it. I leave the Hitlersville for a moment, and I come to how the Jewish people who were in Bergen-Belsen. I came to Bergen-Belsen about 2 months after it was liberated. And we, all 5 of us, we invited people from Bergen-Belsen, especially young people who suffered. And we went to Bergen-Belsen. That was 2 months after the liberation, if one can call it, of Bergen-Belsen. And we entertained them, and we said to each other, don't mention the war. It may have an effect on them, it may not have. But they wanted to talk about the war and the years in which they suffered in concentration camp and how they went to the concentration camp. They came mainly from Austria-Hungary. And they were marched on foot from Hungary to Bergen-Belsen. They had nothing to eat. The windows were closed, and they knocked at the doors and asked for food, begging. No response. I cried out. These sufferings which they had, and they talked for hours, sitting out on the table, talking about the suffering which the Jewish people suffered in Bergen-Belsen, and how many died. And what was extraordinary was the fact that they said, you must come to us for a meal. So we went to these barracks, and they provided us with a little egg, boiled egg, a little bit of challah. They washed before the meal, and we benched afterwards. People who suffered like they did showed Menschlichkeit. And it was the most moving sight I've witnessed with all this finding Hitler's will, all the rest of it. Nothing mattered. I then, about 4 or 5 months later, they wrote to me again. And they said, Mr. Rothman, we would like to go to Israel. On those days, Palestine. because it was in Israel. We would like to go to Palestine. It's going to have to go illegally, because we will not be admitted to come, because the English restricted the intake of people from the concentration camp to Israel. And quite frankly, I couldn't advise them. I said, it's up to you, I don't know. I can't say that you can go illegally, and how you do it, I don't know. 3 or 4 months later, I had a letter from Palestine. They arrived safely. So you see, there was all this tragic of extermination of Jews in concentration camps, but Menschlichkeit displayed by these people who suffered, that they hadn't lost their humanity, that they acted rationally, and to talk about it was like a catharsis in psychological terms, which impressed me tremendously. I promise I will not talk more than 60 minutes, so I have to be very... Now, let me tell you something. Before the Nuremberg trial, of course, we had people from who defended the Germans and came to us for further information. And on one occasion I was asked to be there to observe that nothing goes wrong. And I had they were all sitting, and a wonderful German lawyer by the name of Servatius, who incidentally defended later on Eichmann in Israel. And Dr. Servatius, I was most impressed with him. He asked simple questions and hardly talked and let the Germans speak. Now on the right-hand side sat all the Nazis. There was, for example, Gauleiter Forster. And let me just stop there for a moment and tell you why they were arrested and so on. Somebody in the intelligence had a brilliant idea. When the war came to an end, he looked in the directory of the town. Say, for example, he looked at Breslau or something like that. And in there it says, Gauleiter so-and-so, Kreisleiter so-and-so, Ostgruppenleiter so-and-so. So he phoned them all up, said, come inside, and they were arrested. It's a brilliant idea. Yes? A very, very brilliant idea. The only thing is this. It can go wrong, because if one of the chaps couldn't come, he sent somebody else. So people were arrested who had nothing to do with it. They wanted to hear what was going on. So there were all the Gauleiters or Kreisleiters or Ortsgruppenleiters and all the people who represented them. So we had the task of sorting these people out and sending them back where they belong to. And it's not a big idyll, as you say. Now, I was an interrogator in the E-compound. The E-compound where all the high-ranking Nazis, from Kreisleiters to Ortsgruppenleiters, no, Kreisleiter, Gauleiters and so on, and the very high-ranking officers. Now, coming back to Dr. Servatius, who defended these people, and to the people who were in this very large room, one side all the Nazis, the other side all the high-ranking officers, the generals. And Dr. Servatius said, could you please explain what happened there? You are accused of having in the main road of Danzig, they were hanging from the trees, and you hang all those who opposed Nazism. Is that correct? So Gauleiter from Danzig said, I can't remember anybody. And on the other side, the German generals, you bloody liar, how can you say we saw them hanging from the trees, innocent people? And they started almost to fight, which I have to ask you very politely to sit down and listen to Dr. Zawacki, there's more questions to ask. But you see, they were so indoctrinated that even things which are visible from every point, they denied to the end. And then, as you know, there was in Nuremberg the high officers who served the sentence. Mostly they were condemned to death. Some received 10 or 20 years, and then also 3 of them were let free. That was the Frankfurt trial and the Nuremberg trial predeceased that of the Frankfurt trial. There was a Frankfurt trial between 63 and 65, the longest trial in the history of Germany. And guess what? When I was in Münsterlager for a short period, and Münsterlager was the discharge center of the German army. There are 450,000 to be discharged. I was in charge of 11 interrogators who, before there was a discharge, they had to be interrogated and see whether they had known any war crimes against them before they were discharged. Now, that was a very lengthy trial, went on for quite some time. And I found that somebody who worked as an interpreter was a German. And what was more, that he was in Auschwitz. Yes, he was in Auschwitz. And he was a very, very nice, intelligent chap, spoke English well, because he came from Brazil. His father was a Brazilian, the mother was German. However, they didn't get on with each other, and she took the young boy and brought him back to Berlin, put him into a good education, and as he could not see well, he was not fit to go and fight. He was sent to Auschwitz. And he wrote a report about life in Auschwitz. He was an intelligent chap. I was wondering what he was doing there, working for the British. But I was assured nothing is known against him which would incriminate him or bring him to trial. So he worked for the British. What happened in consequence? In 1958, in Munich, they found lots of documents. The Germans now they have found a lot of paintings and all the rest of it, published in yesterday's paper and so on. But in those days they found all these documents hidden. And as a result, when you read these documents, he wasn't so innocent as he said he is. And they have an Auschwitz trial, which, as I said before, is the longest in history, between 63 and 65. Now I remembered that he gave me a copy of what he wrote in book form. And I said, I have 6 copies made of this because interesting reading. What happened at Auschwitz, from a German's point of view. However, the Germans took a different attitude. They said, look, if he knows all that, how was he involved? They investigated him further and found that he was played not a large part, but a part in the well, I don't wish to tell you what happened in Auschwitz because it may offend people. If you hear that, it may bring things. The way the people died in Auschwitz, it's not shooting them, but starving them, hitting them, doing and so on. It was a terrible thing which he wrote, but in actual fact he also appeared to participate in this trial. Now, when the Auschwitz trial was, when I had this document with me, I gave it to the war office and said, can I send that to Frankfurt? And they looked at it for about 2 weeks and said, you can. I was invited to come, one can call it invite, to come to Frankfurt during the Auschwitz trial. And I think, to the best of my knowledge, I was the only British subject to give evidence in this lengthy, nearly 3-year trial. In 1964, when I went, obviously, I've given evidence and said that I know this chap who worked for us in the British intelligence. When I was in charge of the 43rd Intelligence Section, he was there as an interpreter. And that's all. He cooperated with us and so on. And we are at the time not aware that he committed any crimes. And he was given, I think, 4 years at the Auschwitz trial. But again, who knows and who can give evidence that anybody is innocent or anybody is you can see what I have seen. I've seen it in Fallingbostel, incidentally, where I was an interrogator, and I did something which you should never do. Use language which is unacceptable and have a major looking after the welfare of the people in Auschwitz. A British he was about I would simply need to say rabbi, but a Welsh priest. And when I used the word, you are the Abschaum der Menschheit, some of the Israeli, and during one speech they were complaining of having nothing to eat. And I went to address these 450 high-ranking Nazis, and I thought we couldn't bring any food because there was snow. There was this, and we are very, very late. I said, what are you complaining? What have you done? People starved to death, for we were responsible. And for that, I was reported that I used language which was not fair to the others. But fortunately, common sense came about, and I said, it's nonsense, of course, it was rubbish. It's the only time I got into trouble. And now I think I've come to the end because I said I would stop. There are some very nice things which also happen. For example, they made, I discussed with my wife, but I should mention it. There was a film being made, and they needed, it's called The Captive Heart. Anybody remember that? No. There were people, I have to put here, Michael Redgrave, Melvin Johns, Basil Bradford, Jacob, it was Cavalcanti was the director, and I acted as interpreter. That's the only time I didn't play a big part in the film. I was only the interpreter. but it was a relief from the terrible things I heard when I interrogated people. Yes? It was so. The only thing I think, and I didn't lose my temper, but I showed my, obviously, the story which I heard of someone who said, I said, we accused here in my, what I have a list here, you were accused when you, in Holland, and the German army was retreating, that you shot 250 people. Can you explain, is it true? He said, yes. I haven't had time to put them in front of a court. I couldn't do, there was no time. And I know they were guilty, they did A, B, and C, and they gave me a whole list. I said, you acted as judge, and you took part in killing 250 people? He said, yes. Well, what else could I do in the circumstances? And I didn't say it. I said, but please write it down on paper. He wrote it down on paper. Now what happened to him is, I don't know. But you can guess what happened to somebody who openly told me that he shot 250 people. It's never happened to me before. If anybody killed somebody, he tried to hide it. And he wouldn't tell it to me. But this man, and don't forget, I was a youngster, 20, and 21 later on. Yes? I was very, very young, and a refugee. I came to a week before the war broke out. Yes? Can you the effect it had on a young man hearing this sort of thing? It's impossible now to realize that. Now that times are fairly normal. Yes, there's no perfection. Perfection doesn't exist. But we have a normal way of life. But can you imagine, at my age, hearing all this from people, yes, I lived in Germany. I was born in Germany, although my father was Polish and served in the Austrian army. Yes? And he came to Germany, married a German Jewish woman, my mother, who was born in Germany, who also had parents who were born in Germany. I gave you briefly my background, and I'm exposed, I use the word exposed, to this sort of life of killing, murdering, and somebody telling me to kill 250 people because you couldn't put them in court and nothing else. On the retreat, there's the compassion. There's the humanity. What does it show? And that's the thing you're subjected to at a young age. As I say, I was the youngest. Unfortunately, all the people who were born interrogators, whom I very much very fond of, we had a very, very nice community of 5. We exchanged notes, which is understandable, but that's all. But now, it was up to, like Dr. Sebastian, to defend him. He's a German, very capable man, who then, as I said before, went to defend Eichmann, unsuccessfully. Yes? He showed me the 2 types of German. One, rationally, not showing his emotions. Yes. He must have been clear because he would not go to Nuremberg and defend Germans. And then later on in 1961 or 62 to Israel and to defend Eichmann. Yes? So you have experienced Germans, and I personally, and my parents, I think a German who brought my father out of concentration camp, to whom I said here, this book is dedicated to Herr Belgard, the police inspector in Berlin, who saved my life, that of my family, a truly, truly righteous Gentile. He managed to get my father out of Sachsenhausen. And my friend, my best friend, they managed to get out after 6, 7, 8 months. And he said, get out immediately. Do not hesitate. There is no time in Berlin. Immediately out. My father heeded his advice. My best friend did not. When I heard that his parents are still alive in Berlin, immediately after when the war finished, of course, I went to see them. They said, when we opened the door, we thought it was our son. We only had one son. I could not tell them that he was, that I knew that he was shot, because he waited too long and he was shot. I couldn't do this. So they had still that belief, but somebody must have told them that he's no longer alive. He was my age, but 2 or 3 months older, and so on. But to see the stories, the family stories, which affected either ordinary people, people who were in charge, who were played a very important part in Hitler's government. You met them all. How is it, you can ask the question, that men had no compassion of what they did? Perhaps a psychiatrist may explain it. A psychologist may explain it. I have no answer. When you met them and you interrogated them, they seemed to be ordinary people. And the way they gave the answers. Like when they asked the thing, Forster, the one from Gauleiter, from Danzig. And they said they're hanging from the trees, all because, for what reason? And you didn't see them? And you say you didn't see them? How can you say that? And here you have the Germans sitting on this side, who said, "Du Lügner, you lie." And they said it, and they came really to fights. That a man can say, who was responsible for Danzig and the surroundings, the Gauleiter, the top man, and he even denied to the end. Yes, he was, incidentally, at the subsequent thing, he received a death sentence for all the things he's done. And there are so many stories attached to it, which shows, in one way, humanity, compassion, understanding, and many other things. On the other hand, people who closed their eyes or even tried to deny as if nothing happened. They knew, and as I lived in Germany, I knew that in 1938, when they arrested the Jews, put them in concentration camps. And I can tell you one story and I will finish. a man came to my father, and he was very, very friendly. Came with his wife, and friends of my father and my mother. And then all of a sudden, one day, just a woman came in and said, "You know where so-and-so is? He's in concentration camp. He's in Dachau." Yes? All right. Yes, as long as he's alive. And then she came 2 weeks later and showed us the letter. "Your husband died, and you owe us 8 marks for his cremation." And that sums it up in a way. The cruelty, on the one hand, but some Germans were compassionate. And so this shows the man who is responsible, who got my father out of concentration camp, so that he could eventually, after 4 years floating about on the continent, went to Israel. And we have, very, very fortunately, we have a very lovely family in Israel. Because my wife and I, in 1953, I saw my parents again. Yes, we paid £250, which was 10% on a house, for that pleasure of seeing my parents alive. Who would have thought? Thank you.
So, Hermie, this has been absolutely riveting, and I have to say I've been enthralled by what you've said so far. There's so much that I would like to ask you, and there's so much that I know that you would like to ask Hermie. I promised not to be selfish at the beginning of this talk. I promised only to ask one question, but if I may, with your agreement, I'll ask 3 before handing over.
I want to know, sir.
But my first question is this. You were doing all this when you were in your very early 20s.
I'm 20.
And you're
And I'm now 90.
You could pass for 60, you could pass for 70. You're 90s, early 90s, but you were a very, very young man when you were interrogating these top Nazis. Were you interrogated by these people? Or?
No. I interrogated and I took charge. You had to take charge. And you had to show that to be neutral. It's very difficult. When you hear people saying, "Oh, well, like this chapter, 250 people killed them," well, that's nothing. I have to do, what could I do? What else? And that's the German story. If they admitted to something, they found the reason for it. Now, the people who were in Auschwitz and killed the Jewish people, who put them in, I don't want to mention it, but how can they say, "Oh yes, you see, when the Germans get an order to do it, you must do it. You mustn't use your common sense and your brains and all your compassion. You can't do that." A German had to obey orders. And we hear the stories again and again. And I had to take it down and write it down. The man says, and let them take them to trial. And then they had a 3-year trial at the Auschwitz trial. And I gave evidence there. I was impressed, of course, the Germans do everything in style. There were so many of the judges sitting there. And when they read the report a German gave me, the one I said who was in Brazil, who came to the mother and so on, he wrote a wonderful thing. I've got it. It's in book form. And they read it out in the court, and people fainted This was their normal reaction, because he went in details how they were shot and killed and all the rest of it. But a document like that, not written by a Jew, by a friendly elder, but the man who was in Auschwitz, he condemned himself in a way, because he suffered, he got 4 years. He was a nice man, he ordinary man. I didn't engage him, he was there, and when I took over the 43rd Intelligence Section, only for a period. Yes? But if anybody can find a reasonable, acceptable or explanation how people can kill and kill and kill, I leave out quite a number of them. I heard somebody, a Nazi who wasn't, not a Nazi, he was a policeman who was in the, since 1922 he served the police. And he acted as double agent. He acted for the Nazis, and then he passed on all this information to all the people who opposed the Nazis. Yes, von Witzleben, for example, who was later on shot in 1944. I can tell you so many stories there, and if you have time till 12 o'clock or so, I'm quite willing to do it, provided you're interested.
Can I take you back to something that for me was one of the most dramatic moments in the book, which was the discovery of the will itself. Now, as I understand it, this document was actually sewn into the uniform of somebody who was captured.
Yeah.
What happened?
There was another Jewish person involved, an Akbas Kratum. That's the thing. He worked as a manager there. But he knew exactly this is not right, if this is too thick. And that he ripped it open and found this for Hitler's will and Goebbels' appendix. Because it's only another Jewish boy who did it. He was a corporal in the army, and he phoned immediately us, and that's why we had to have this meeting. But it's extraordinary, first of all, that all these Nazis are being interrogated by Jewish people, refugees from Germany. That's 5 of them. That's myself included. And no, you explain it. I can't. Good, next one.
I was going to say that when the call came, and you had the opportunity to look at this will, you must have thought to yourself, this wasn't just Hitler's last will. In a sense, these were Hitler's last words and his last thoughts. What insight, translating them, did it give you into his state of mind?
It's not odd, but it falls into line. If you live in Germany, like I have, born in 1924, went to school there, to a Jewish school, saw what went on in Germany, saw then in 1938 the burning of the synagogues and all the rest of it, and saw what really happened, then everything is feasible. I mean, the only thing is this, it did segregate those Germans, but I say, look here, nobody is guilty until found guilty. Because there were some, as I said, the chap whom I wrote this book, who got my father out of concentration camp, got even my best friend at the same time. Yeah? But you know how Jewish children are, they don't always listen to what they should do. Now he was, how old was he? Was 15, and he wanted to see his parents, instead of listening to the German officer, police officer, who got him out of concentration camp, which was an unusual thing. Yes, and he apologized for getting them out too very late. You said you know bureaucracy, how it is the Germans, and to need this paper, and then before you release anybody. The odd and unfortunate thing is that this man lost his life in 1943 because I'm inquiries. How can one thank a man in terms? How he saved my father's life. He tried to do my best friend. And he lost his life because there was a bombing attack in 1943 and he was in Hamburg or somewhere, and that's where he lost his life. But the only thing I could do is devote this book to him because he was a righteous German. And there were many like that who resisted Hitler. The only thing is, a lot of them also were found out and shot and God knows what. If anybody can give me a rational explanation to what happened in Germany, who are ordinary people like you and me and everybody else, and how they can become animals and shoot other ones, give me an explanation. Ask the psychiatrist. There is no reasonable explanation given to the behavior of me. There are many things I could have gone in greater detail. But I can't because it's not fair on people who listen. Because I said I want to not speak more than between 60 to 90 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, can we take some questions?
Yeah, I want to ask a question. First of all, I wanted to tell you that my father's Auschwitz uniform is in the Imperial War Museum. That's one thing I wanted to tell you. The question is as follows. Where was the will from the time you saw it? Where was the will all this year? It's now in the Imperial War Museum, as I understand. Where that period of 70 years, where is it gone?
Well,
where was it?
I haven't told you about Trevor Roper. I worked for Trevor Roper, who's the man who wrote this book about the death of Hitler. He revised it. He wrote a first book which contained some different varieties of what transpired. But he wrote, for example, he wrote about Hermann Karner, whom I interrogated. I don't know, if I make this a lengthy story, then at the end there will be about 2 people sitting in the other room. No, it is because that in itself is the thing, how I went to interrogate this man, or wrote my report about it. That's a story in itself. Hermann Karner was the man who saw Hitler being dead, and who gave me a version how he killed himself. And there was a thing whether he took only poison or whether he shot himself. So on and so forth. One said he shot himself and then took poison. And he, this Hermann Karner, went and then saw him lying down on the ground with his wife, Eva Braun, yes, and wrapped up and partly burning. It's an interesting thing when you read this book here about Hermann Karner. I marked it up here. Shouldn't have done it, but that's a story in itself. How to discover Hitler being dead and how he killed him. Trevor Roper was supposed to write about the bunker. That's the bunker. And what went on there. But he ended up writing about Hitler's death because what happened to these copies of the will? What happened to Johann Meyer? What happened to Zander? These are all the people involved in having copies of the will. Yes? They went into hiding, and then it's a story in itself, a fantastic story. Then they came to Johann Meyer and said, no, I haven't got it. I have no copy. I have no copy. And then after interrogation for about 2 days, he then admitted that the copy was in his garden. And he dug it out and he sent it, he gave him a copy. That's a story in itself. What happened to Zander? Oh, fantastic story. He went to Switzerland, went to hiding. And what happened to Lorenz in that period that he had the Hitler's will, and it was found about 4, 5, 6 months later. These are fantastic stories. I get so excited about it.
Yeah. Next question, please. Dennis.
Hermie,
Yeah.
you were interrogating very senior German officers.
Yes.
What rank did you have? It couldn't have been anything like what they had, and why I would have thought that the Germans would not have listened to somebody from a foreign army with a low rank.
You're absolutely right. When I started, I was a sergeant. And one of them said to me, he was arrested, and he said, came with uniform. I said, he said, you can't, I'm not going to be arrested by you, sergeant. I said, fine, I show you. Took off his things, ripped it all off. I said, no, you're a private.
Who's the next question? Who do I see?
Did he tell us the
Sorry.
Hi, it's a very small world. My uncle was an interpreter, and he was involved in the interrogation of the commandant of Auschwitz, for which his own parents had perished. And the interrogation papers never made their way to the Public Record Office until he passed away, and his wife passed them to me. And I took them to the Imperial War Museum, who were absolutely thrilled to have them. So these things do have a habit of disappearing and reappearing 50 years later. So I have a copy of them. And honestly, as you say, the Rudolf Höss proudly says how everything was managed in the camp and how they exterminated. And it's like reading a D.D.S. Smith recipe. It's absolutely unbelievable.
The thing which I sometimes, I'm astonished at, the maturity I had, you were 20-year-old, yes? And when you see now my grandchildren who went to university and so on, looking for a job and doing this and doing this, so I thought, look, I was very much younger than they. I know they finished their university. I was very fortunate, incidentally, that I did go to university here. I went to Westminster, and later on, in 1983 or 84, I took another degree because I wanted to learn. I wanted to become a psychiatrist, in actual fact, simply because of the experience I had. And I also read a lot of books on the subject. And I wanted to become a psychiatrist, but I had to study for 8 years, and I couldn't. I got from the British government, I got 18 pounds a month to start with. That was my thing. I couldn't keep myself. If I wouldn't have worked, yes, so on. But anyhow, as you must probably know, I ended up in the KKR Executive Trustee Company. I was the managing director there for 32 years. And it was a very satisfying position I had. But then, namely, that people gave lots of money to Israel for you know what the Jewish National Fund, the Jewish National Fund does in Israel, and how they help Israel. All the forests you see, the Jewish National Fund. I had great satisfaction doing that, doing something for the community. Yes, that's how I could repay for my parents, who are very lucky. They lived to 1972, 73. My father died at the age of 78. Yes, nearly 78. My mother was very much younger. This was 72 or 73, and that's something which I cannot explain. Yes, that I was able to see my parents again, because when I heard through correspondence which I received through Switzerland, to Sweden, that my father was taken to a concentration camp, I knew that he would not come out. Yes, and then, as I say, don't need to repeat it, I was very, very lucky. The Almighty was with me.
I'm fascinated that you were able to actually see a copy of the will in full. Do you know when it was written? What date?
Yes. It was written on the 29th of April, 45, when war stopped. He went and dictated it. And you know, that's another thing, is how did Hitler do that? How did he dictate? I mean, I interrogated quite a number of people who were in the bunker and so on. That's if you invite me next week, I'll come again.
Well, was it typewritten?
Huh?
Was it typewritten?
Yes. The thing, why it is extraordinary, because I've never seen that before in my life. It was, first of all, it was on parchment, which is very unusual. That's one. And second thing, the letters were very much larger than a normal typewriter. You must forget, in 1945 or 44, so the typewriter was worked on different principles, as they do now. And everything was, if you receive a letter or something like that, and it wasn't so nicely as it is done now. Yes, and you knew exactly, without you didn't ask another question, you saw that's Hitler. Everything fine, everything perfect. Yes, obviously a Jew didn't do it, but he did.
Is it possible to find a translation of it?
Oh yes, in my book.
In your book? You haven't mentioned your book.
Yes, now he wrote, I will just repeat it, a political will, blaming all the Jews for what happened to him. That's understandable. And then the second one was his private one, which we gave all the things which he had of a few paintings. He was a painter himself. Yeah? And if you've seen some of the paintings, they're all right. I don't want to take any artistry away from him, but they're all right. But he had something of impressing people. He had a personality, and he could shout. I met him for the first time. It's an interesting thing. Forgive me 2 minutes. I used to take, my brother is 9.5 years younger than me. Incidentally, he also came with my parents, eventually landed up in Israel, and he served in the Israeli army. But coming back to, what was I going to say?
You met Hitler.
I'm sorry, I lost my time.
That you met Hitler.
Yes. I met Hitler with my brother. I took him for, we didn't live very far from the center of Berlin. And I took, because he was very much younger, I took him one day to Unterlinden. Later on there was restrictions for Jewish people to walk. But as I was a Pole by nationality, my father was Polish, served in the Austrian army. He said had a Polish passport. It didn't happen later on, but it helped me in a way, because I could go on both sides. A German Jew was forbidden in 1938 or something, was forbidden to go on the other side of Unterlinden. I was on this, and somebody said, der Führer kommt, and they pushed me forward with my brother. Yeah? I wasn't fun thing, I was afraid going back. They also went with a Heil. I don't know whether I did it or not, I can't remember. And Hitler was in an open carriage, standing up and doing this sort of thing, and then followed by Goebbels and all the entourage and all the rest of it. That's the first when I saw Hitler. Yes. And I didn't see him since afterwards. But it's a funny feeling you have. Yes, that's all. And you knew, and I did not know at the time what I know after his death. Yes, he became a different Hitler. I know he was all his things against Jews, on the talk about Jews. He said in every speech, the Jews to blame for this, the Jews to blame for that. And in his, you raised this question about his addendum and what he says in his will, in his political will. Pages of what the Jews responsible for this, Jews responsible for that. There are copies here, right? You can read my book. But seriously, if a psychiatrist could explain why a man had so much power, yes, and so much influence on the rest of the world, he was thinking in this memorandum, which I mentioned, that's the Horsbach memorandum. It was a secret document. Why was that not exposed before? Why did it so take long until 1948 or 47 to expose that document? Because it gives you all the answers. I didn't know about this Horsbach until I read the book about this encyclopedia of the Third Reich. And when I asked people, have you heard of the Horsbach? Germans? No. But that clearly defines Hitler. That he wanted to go to war, and that was written in 1937, on the 5th of November 1937. And when people said he was forced into war, they don't know what they're talking about. It was planned. And next question.
Sir.
Were the people you interrogated aware that you were Jewish? And if so, what was their reaction?
First of all, nobody knew that we were Jewish. It was not concern of the Germans who interrogated them who we are. Yes? And secondly, when you have... I know I was the youngest. I was 20, and then later on 21. And the others, my colleagues, were older than me. So, one was 34. Yes, but the rest were all 26, 27, 28, and so on. How did it affect us? And I can tell you that nobody shows how. We were discussing various things. And later on, say for example, after we finished our work, and at 5 or 5 or 6, somebody would say to me, oh, you know, I had somebody coming up and tell me A, B, and C, and D, and so on. And, oh yes, that's quite interesting. Well, how did you deal with that now? We had to be impartial. We had to produce a report which would stand up in court, yes. But that wasn't our business. Yes? We were not lawyers, although I turned later on to be one. Honestly, objectively, we try to be objective now. Because if we would not be objectively, we wouldn't do our job. Yes, I mean, people want to get rid of us. Like this major, when I used the Abschaum der Menschheit. Yeah? And to the Germans, and I said, look, you're to blame for this. Look, we can't bring the food, which is because of the conditions now. We can't have food, we can't food. I said, you produced this situation. You were not here. If you wouldn't have joined the Nazi party and took up the rank for God knows what, who's to blame? Yes. This major, this English major, this Welsh major, he didn't like it. Yes, that's the sort of speech of a Welshman, although it wasn't in Wales for quite some time.
Can I ask you something? I'm intrigued by a number of dimensions to this, one of which is that I think, by my calculation, you are the only person left alive who has any first-hand insight into the mindset of the people who were with Hitler in his bunker just before he died. Now, what was the way of thinking among these people who you interrogated? Were they, on the one hand, complete Hitler loyalists, or were they trying to make out that they were just following orders?
I mentioned that there was this conference in front Dr. Zalazis came, and on the right-hand side sat the Nazis and the high-ranking Nazis, and then the high-ranking was on this side. and so on. And if you read what happened at the Nuremberg trial, some Nazis, of course, repented and said, look, we didn't know which was all wrong. Everybody knew. Why shouldn't they be? It's ridiculous even to maintain that. Yes? Some, to the end, said, we have no remorse. Some said yes. Yes? And some said also they were killed and hanged and so on. But this is a phenomenon which nobody really, I've seen books and books and books. Nobody could, in intelligent psychological terms, explain how these people acted and why they had no compassion. Some generals, for Witzleben, for example, who was shot in 1944, the field marshal. Yes? I heard his, look, if I go along and tell you these things, you would not believe it. Because a German Gestapo officer, yeah, he would spy on the military, and he also was spied for the Nazis. He had a dual nationality. He's a very lovely man. He said, Mr. Rothman, if you want to know anything, I'll tell you. Yes? Well, they were open. Because I suppose he was more expecting softer sentiments. I don't know. There might have been no, I don't want to do this. But really, if anybody can explain in the German mentality, people who did so much for mankind, who did so much and so on, who the Jewish people in Germany contribute to the welfare, to culture, to every sphere, and then you won't shoot them. What can you explain this to normal people?
What about the man at the top of the tree, Adolf Hitler himself?
Yes.
What insight do you have as to whether he was mad or bad? This last mad diatribe against the Jews, for example, in the will.
Something which I spoke about in a few words. But if you have the Hossbach memorandum, there is an explanation. They wanted to become completely independent from anybody. Yes? And when you're independent from everybody else, you did no raw material from France or anywhere else, you can do whatever you like. And that was his aim. If anybody can give me a reasonable, acceptable answer to Hitler's behavior, then I like to hear it. I can't. And to the Nazis who were then, I know they were of low intellect, some of them, yes? And they would have done anything for the Führer, even killed themselves. Explain that.
Before we finish, I want to see if there are any other questions. There's one from the rabbi, and then I've got a few concluding remarks of my own. Rabbi Sebastian,
Actually, it's two half questions then. So, I was interested about Dr. Pronounce it Servatius? Or
Servatius.
Did he only defended Nazis? He never prosecuted? Was he a Nazi himself?
No. The list of people acting for the defense was enormous. And in this book here, they give you all the about 50 defense lawyers. Because there 30 odd people, or at one time then Goering of course committed suicide and so on. But there were 22 people there hanged, and so on. 3 were discharged, from Neurath and people like this were discharged. But if you can, Dr. Servatius was a terrific lawyer. He impressed me. He listened to these people, and I could see his thoughts. But as a defense lawyer, as I said, there were many others, but he wanted to who defended very high Nazi top people.
So, during the war, what was he doing?
Huh?
What was he himself doing during the war?
He must have been clear, because they wouldn't have asked him to act in the Nürnberg as a defense lawyer. And then also he went later on in 61, 62, Eichmann. Yes? I mean, to defend Eichmann, you get in that's no defense. How can you defend? But somehow or other, because of this, he was a decent chap who impressed me. Because I was there all day long, listening in, staying there with him as neutral observer. And the way he asked these questions were very, not long. Why did you do that? In the circumstances, would it not be better to do A, B, C, D? That's all he said. And then waiting for the answer. That's a very, very good question. How the German impressed me. The way he defended people who were indefensible.
Now, you mentioned your friend, and that you visited your friend's parents after the war.
Yes.
So where had they been during the war? And had they were presumably Jews. Had they stayed in Berlin in freedom throughout the war, or had they been in concentration camp themselves?
The conditions which prevailed between 39 to 45, until the war spent, were extraordinary. And survival for a lot of these people, look, at the end, who fought for him? Who fought for Hitler? 15, 16, 17-year-old boys. Because there was nothing left. And look at it, I didn't deal with Goering why he wanted to make peace. I didn't think it was Himmler who did the thing. The story about Himmler. Yes, he was in the camp. It was my responsibility there to see order, especially when they made this film, which I mentioned, the whole. I don't want to go into it because it takes up too much time. But it is difficult to see the conditions which prevail and the answers which you get. When you ask them a simple question, yes, some will say, I said, look, you wrote to your wife, and I read just extracts from it. He said, I had to do it. Because if they thought I was an opposer of Hitler, they would have killed me. So he pretended that the letter which he wrote was a defense mechanism which saved him from being killed by Hitler. The answers given to straightforward questions which you ask were extraordinary. I mean, the chap who was Forster in charge of Danzig and the provinces around there, yes, saying to me that, oh no, I never saw dead people. An idiot of a man, because he knows there are God knows how many witnesses who saw them hanging, like they shouted, "Du Blügner!" These high-ranking officers who sat on the other side of the table, shouting at him, "How dare you say this to them?" If anybody can give me a reasonable answer, how reasonable people, ordinary people, who contributed so much in 1870, 1900, all over the years, Germans contributed much to ordinary people, and then turn in 39, 40, 41, and gave Hitler the service he required. Most of them were frightened. If you don't conform, that's your lot. And that's what you do.
Ladies and gentlemen, I know that we could continue for many hours yet. I certainly could, and I can see that Hermie still could. I would, however, before we close, like to make a couple of observations of my own, and then I know that Leslie has something to say. Time and time again, during the course of this evening, I have found myself coming back to something that you said at the very start, that you were so young when you were doing all this. You were part of a very special generation that had a huge burden on your shoulders. And I think it has been such a privilege for us all to be in the presence of someone who not only has had an interest in history, not only has lived through history, but has been part of history. I'm sure we would all like to express our appreciation.